The first time my sister-in-law touched me, my wife was standing less than 10 feet away. That was the part that stayed with me. Not the touch itself. Not even the way Lydia's fingers lingered against the inside of my wrist while she handed me a coffee mug in my own kitchen. It was the fact that Claire was right there at the stove, humming softly while stirring soup, completely unaware that her younger sister had just looked at me in a way no married woman should ever look at her brother-in-law, especially not during Thanksgiving dinner, especially not while her husband sat in the living room watching football. People think betrayal arrives loudly. It doesn't. Most of the time, it enters quietly, smiling, carrying pie. I remember looking down at the mug because I didn't know where else to look. It was one of those old ceramic cups Claire liked collecting from antique stores, white with little blue flowers around the rim. I'd chipped the handle years earlier and apologized for days afterward, even though she'd laughed and told me it was fine. Back then, I still believed small things mattered in marriage. Lydia leaned closer while Claire kept stirring. "You work too hard, Daniel," she said softly. Her perfume hit me before her words did. Something expensive, warm vanilla mixed with smoke. I pulled my hand away immediately. "Coffee's hot," I muttered. She smiled, not embarrassed, not apologetic, just amused, like she'd learned something. I should have said something to Claire that night. That's the mistake people always think they wouldn't make until they're standing inside the moment themselves. They imagine honesty arrives clean and immediate, but life isn't built that way. Families are fragile ecosystems held together by routines and avoidance and years of carefully maintained peace. One accusation can poison an entire house, and I already knew what kind of woman Lydia was. She was beautiful in the exhausting way some people are, the kind that made rooms rearrange themselves around her. Men talked louder near her. Women straightened their posture when she entered. Even at 42, she still carried herself like the world owed her attention, and most of the world agreed. Her husband, Eric, certainly did. My younger brother spent half his life orbiting her moods like a nervous moon. He financed every failed business idea she had, defended every cruel remark, smoothed over every awkward dinner conversation after she insulted someone, and laughed it off as honesty. Eric used to be different. Before Lydia, he was quieter, kinder, not weak, just decent. There's a difference. But some people slowly disappear inside the person they marry. By the time they notice it happening, there's barely enough left of them to fight back. I knew because the same thing had started happening to me with Claire years earlier. Only Claire wasn't cruel. She was tired, practical, distant in the way long marriages sometimes become when life turns into bills and obligations and surviving month to month. We weren't unhappy. That was the problem. People notice hatred. Nobody notices indifference until it calcifies. By 58, I had become useful instead of loved. Useful husbands get thanked. They don't get seen. That Thanksgiving ended quietly enough. Eric got drunk watching football. Lydia spent most of the evening laughing too loudly at things nobody said. Claire cleaned dishes, while I packed leftovers into plastic containers for everyone to take home. Normal. That word has buried more suffering than tragedy ever could. Around midnight, after everyone left, I stood alone in the kitchen rinsing gravy from serving spoons. Rain tapped softly against the windows over the sink. Claire had already gone upstairs. Then I noticed Lydia's scarf draped over one of the dining chairs, dark red silk. I picked it up carefully, meaning to text Eric. Something slid from the folds onto the floor. A note, folded twice. At first I assumed it was a grocery list or receipt. But when I unfolded it, I immediately recognized the handwriting. Lydia's. You deserve better than being invisible in your own house. My stomach tightened. There was no signature, no explanation, nothing else, just that sentence. I remember standing there for almost a full minute, listening to the clock over the refrigerator tick louder and louder in the silence. Then Claire walked into the kitchen. "What's that?" I folded the note instantly. "Nothing." Lydia forgot her scarf. Claire nodded absently, already half asleep. "Just leave it by the door." And that should have been the end of it. A healthy man would have told his wife everything right then. But there are moments in life where instinct overrides logic. Some part of me understood immediately that speaking would not simplify anything. It would multiply it. Because accusations involving attractive women rarely land on them first. They land on whoever speaks. So I said nothing. That was November. By Christmas, Lydia had escalated. Not openly. Never openly. That's what made it dangerous. She became subtle in ways only I could recognize. Longer eye contact during family dinners. Brushing against me in narrow hallways. Private smiles across crowded rooms. Comments designed to sound innocent unless you heard the tone underneath them. "You're the only man around here who actually listens. Claire's lucky you never changed." Some women stop appreciating good men once they feel secure. Each sentence harmless by itself. Together they formed something poisonous. And the worst part? I started noticing how invisible I truly had become inside my own marriage. That's how manipulation works sometimes. It doesn't create loneliness. It identifies loneliness already there and quietly wraps itself around it. Claire stopped touching me years ago, unless she needed something handed to her in the kitchen. We still slept beside each other every night. But marriage can become a hallway between two locked rooms if nobody notices the distance growing. Meanwhile, Lydia noticed everything. My routines, my exhaustion, my silence during family dinners. The way I always repaired things without being asked. The way everyone expected me to solve problems automatically. People become dangerous when they study your emotional starvation long enough. One night in January, Eric called, asking if I could help fix their furnace. "It's making some weird rattling noise," he said. "Lydia says the house sounds haunted." I drove over after work. Snow covered their driveway in uneven patches. Lydia answered the door, wearing gray sweatpants and one of Eric's old college sweatshirts. No makeup, barefoot, casual intimacy that frightened me more than flirtation. "Eric had to run to the pharmacy," she said. "He'll be back." I should have left immediately. Instead, I walked downstairs to the furnace. Men like me are conditioned to finish responsibilities before discomfort. That instinct ruins us eventually. The basement smelled faintly of detergent and cedarwood storage boxes. I knelt beside the furnace, checking the filter, while Lydia lingered at the bottom of the stairs behind me. "You know," she said quietly, "you're the only reliable man in this family." I kept my eyes on the furnace panel. "You should wait upstairs. It's cold down here." She didn't move. "Does Claire ever thank you?" The question settled into the room like smoke. Yes, but even I heard the hesitation. Lydia descended the last few stairs slowly. "You hesitated." I stood up immediately. "Eric should be back soon." "He won't." That finally made me look at her. And for the first time, her expression wasn't playful anymore. It was intentional, careful, predatory in a patient kind of way. My chest tightened. "I think you should stop this." "Stop what?" "You know exactly what." She stepped closer. "You really think I'd risk humiliating myself if I wasn't certain you felt it too?" "I don't." "You're lonely, Daniel. There are sentences that expose a person more completely than insults ever can. You're lonely, not unwanted, not attractive, not desired, lonely. Because loneliness in older men becomes invisible after a certain age. People assume we stop needing tenderness once our hair turns gray. They think responsibility replaces emotional hunger. But deprivation doesn't disappear with age. It deepens. I grabbed my coat from the chair near the stairs. This conversation never happened. Her voice hardened for the first time. You think silence protects people. I turned toward the steps. Then she said something that stopped me cold. Claire already suspects you. I looked back slowly. What? Lydia crossed her arms. She told me last month she thinks you've been emotionally distant for years. That's not the same thing. She said sometimes she feels like you resent her. I stared at her, because that part was true. Not hate, not even anger, just exhaustion buried so deeply it started resembling resentment. Lydia tilted her head slightly. You'd be amazed how easy it is to redirect suspicion once it already exists. The furnace rattled softly behind us. Outside, wind scraped branches against the basement window. And for the first time in 32 years of marriage, I felt something unfamiliar crawl into my chest when I thought about my family. Not sadness, not fear, something colder. The realization that someone had quietly entered my life carrying a match and had already begun pouring gasoline where nobody else could see it. I didn't tell Claire about the basement. I told myself it was because I wanted to protect the family, protect Eric, protect the fragile structure of birthdays and Sunday dinners and shared holidays that took decades to build. But the truth was uglier than that. Part of me already understood that once certain accusations enter a marriage, they never fully leave again. Even disproven suspicion leaves fingerprints. So I stayed quiet. Men my age are experts at surviving discomfort silently. We spend decades swallowing things because we think endurance is the same thing as strength. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it just teaches people how much pain they can safely hand you. The drive home that night felt longer than usual. Snow drifted lazily through the headlights, while the windshield wipers dragged back and forth with tired rhythm. I remember gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary, replaying every moment in the basement. You'd be amazed how easy it is to redirect suspicion. That sentence bothered me more than the flirting, because it sounded practiced, not emotional, strategic. When I got home, Claire was asleep on the couch, with the television still glowing softly across the living room walls. Some crime documentary murmured in the background, while rain mixed with sleet against the windows. Her reading glasses had slipped slightly down her nose. For a moment, she looked young again. Not physically. Time had marked both of us honestly. But there are certain sleeping expressions that survive aging, little remnants of the people we once married. I stood there watching her longer than necessary. 32 years together. An entire lifetime built from overtime shifts, mortgage payments, hospital visits, arguments about money, rushed anniversaries, raising children, burying parents, fixing broken appliances at midnight, surviving disappointments. Marriage isn't held together by love alone. It's held together by accumulated survival. I bent down carefully and turned off the television. Claire stirred awake. What time is it? Almost 11. You fixed the furnace? Yeah. She rubbed her eyes slowly. You always fix everything. People think statements like that feel good. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they feel like a job description. I helped her upstairs. She complained quietly about her knees hurting again while brushing her teeth. I listened because that's what long marriages become eventually. Two exhausted people narrating their physical decline beside each other in dim bathroom light. There's intimacy in that too, I suppose. Just not the kind people dream about when they're young. Later, lying beside her in bed, I stared at the ceiling fan, turning slowly overhead, while Claire slept facing the opposite direction. A king-sized bed creates enormous distance between people who stop reaching for each other. I barely slept. By morning, I'd convinced myself Lydia would back off, that the seriousness in my voice, those dares, had frightened her enough to stop whatever dangerous game she thought she was playing. I underestimated how certain people respond to rejection, especially people accustomed to getting what they want. 3 days later, Claire asked me a question while we were grocery shopping. It came out casually, too casually. "Did something happen with Lydia the other night?" I kept pushing the cart. "What do you mean?" "She mentioned you seemed irritated when you left." There it was, the first thread being pulled. "She talks too much," I said quietly. Claire gave a small shrug. "Well," she thought, "maybe she offended you somehow." I looked at my wife carefully, trying to hear something underneath her words. Suspicion, curiosity, concern. But Claire's face remained neutral as she inspected tomatoes. That was another thing age teaches you. Some people become impossible to read after enough years of disappointment. "I was tired," I answered finally. She nodded. Conversation over, but something had shifted. I could feel it, tiny, almost invisible, like the first crack in ice before the entire lake gives way. That weekend, our daughter Emily brought the grandchildren over. The house became noisy again for the first time in weeks. Toys scattered across the carpet, cartoon music playing too loudly, little sneakers abandoned near the front door. I used to think noise was exhausting. Then the children grew up, and silence became worse. My grandson Noah climbed into my recliner, while I fixed one of his toy trucks with a screwdriver from the old toolbox I kept beneath the hallway table. "That thing's older than Mom," Emily laughed. "Still works. So do you," she said absent-mindedly. Absent-mindedly, that part mattered. Nobody notices how often fathers are discussed like machinery until it starts happening to them. Still useful, still functioning, still paying, still fixing, as long as the engine runs. Nobody asks whether it feels tired. While Noah played beside me on the floor, I noticed Claire texting repeatedly across the kitchen, smiling faintly, not unusual. Then her phone buzzed again. I saw Lydia's name briefly illuminate the screen before Claire turned it over. A strange heaviness settled into my stomach. Not jealousy, something closer to instinct. Later that evening, after Emily left, Claire folded laundry while I repaired a loose cabinet hinge near the pantry. "I invited Eric and Lydia over next Saturday," she said. The screwdriver slipped slightly in my hand. "What?" "Dinner." I kept my voice even. "Thought we just saw them." Claire folded another towel carefully. "You know Lydia. She hates being alone." There was something ironic about hearing that sentence. Some people create loneliness around themselves and then complain about standing in the middle of it. I tightened the hinge too hard. The screw stripped slightly. Claire looked up. "You okay?" "Fine," she hesitated. Then casually, too casually again, she said, "Lydia thinks you don't like her." I stared at the cabinet door. "That's ridiculous. She says you avoid talking to her." I finally looked at my wife. "And?" Claire shrugged lightly. "I told her you've just been stressed lately." There it was again. Stress, distance, emotional withdrawal. Lydia wasn't accusing me directly, not yet. She was building atmosphere, carefully, like stacking dry wood before lighting a match. I suddenly remembered something my father told me decades earlier, while we repaired roofing shingles during a summer storm. Never trust people who create confusion and then offer themselves as the calm solution. At the time, he'd been talking about a dishonest contractor in town. But standing there in my kitchen at 58 years old, I finally understood he'd been talking about human beings in general. Dinner the following Saturday felt wrong from the moment they arrived. Eric looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, shirt wrinkled, hands trembling slightly while opening a beer. Lydia looked radiant. That contrast bothered me immediately. People who feed emotionally on chaos often appear energized while everyone around them deteriorates. Claire had cooked pot roast. The smell filled the house warmly while rain hammered softly against the dining room windows. The grandfather clock near the stairs ticked louder during pauses in conversation. At one point, Emily called asking whether Noah had left his backpack behind. Claire stepped into the hallway to answer. That left me alone in the dining room with Lydia for less than 30 seconds. More than enough. She leaned toward me slightly while Eric stared at his phone. "You look nervous," she whispered. "I'm asking you one last time to stop." "Or what?" I lowered my voice carefully. "You're going to destroy this family." A tiny smile touched her mouth. "No, Daniel." Then she glanced toward the hallway where Claire stood talking on the phone. "You are." The front door suddenly opened. Our son Michael stepped inside carrying grocery bags. He'd had his own key since college, despite being 30 years old now. "Smells good in here," he announced. Normal life resumed instantly. That was the terrifying part. People imagine manipulation looking dramatic, but most emotional destruction happens underneath ordinary evenings, under gravy boats and polite conversation, under family photographs hanging peacefully on walls. At dinner, Lydia barely looked at me. She laughed with Claire, asked Michael about work, refilled Eric's drink repeatedly, while gently correcting small details in his stories, until he stopped talking altogether. Nobody noticed, I did, because men who spend their lives holding families together eventually become experts in invisible tension. Halfway through dessert, Michael mentioned a woman from his office getting divorced. Apparently, the husband was having some emotional affair with her sister, he said. Whole thing got ugly. The room shifted, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but I felt it. Lydia looked down at her wine glass. Claire glanced at me for half a second too long, and Eric suddenly became very interested in cutting pie. That was the moment I understood something horrifying. This had already moved beyond Lydia. Some kind of conversation had happened without me. Maybe vague, maybe indirect, but seeds had been planted. I looked around the table at my family, my wife, my son, my brother, and the woman quietly studying all of us, like someone watching a fuse burn toward dynamite. Then Michael laughed awkwardly. Anyway, people are insane. Nobody answered him. The grandfather clock ticked loudly in the silence. And for the first time in my entire adult life, I realized I was sitting at my own dinner table, surrounded by people who might already be wondering whether I was capable of betraying them. After dinner, I stood alone at the kitchen sink, washing plates while everyone else moved into the living room. That had become my role over the years, not because Claire demanded it, not even because anyone consciously expected it anymore. I simply drifted toward unfinished tasks automatically, the way old horses still walk familiar routes long after the farm has been sold. In the living room, laughter rose and fell beneath the television noise. Michael arguing with Eric about football. Claire asking Emily over speakerphone whether Noah's cough sounded worse tonight. Lydia's voice threading softly through all of it. Comfortable, warm, domestic. Families can look healthy from 10 feet away, while rotting quietly underneath. I rinsed gravy from a serving spoon and caught my reflection faintly in the dark kitchen window. Older than I felt inside, that realization sneaks up on men. One day, people stop seeing possibility when they look at you. They only see utility, reliability, predictability, a fixed object in the background of their lives. The frightening part isn't aging, it's becoming emotionally invisible while still physically present. You missed a spot. I turned. Lydia stood in the kitchen doorway holding an empty wine glass. I set the spoon down immediately. You shouldn't be in here alone with me. She leaned casually against the frame. That sounds guilty. I'm serious. And I'm tired of you acting terrified of me. My jaw tightened. You've crossed enough lines already. No, her voice stayed calm. You just haven't admitted you noticed them. The house hummed softly around us. Refrigerator motor, television laughter, rain tapping against the gutters outside. Ordinary sounds. That's what made the conversation feel unreal. You need to stop manipulating this family. She tilted her head slightly. That's interesting. What is? You think you're protecting them? I am. A faint sadness crossed her face then. Real sadness this time, or something convincing enough to resemble it. Daniel, nobody protects fathers once they stop being useful. I stared at her. Because manipulative people often become dangerous precisely when they tell partial truths. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. Do you know what Claire says about you when you're not around? Enough. She thinks you checked out emotionally years ago. That's between me and my wife. But you never actually fight for her, do you? The words landed harder than they should have, not because they were true, because I suddenly wasn't certain they were false. Long marriages create emotional habits difficult to examine honestly. You stop questioning the shape of your own silence after enough years living inside it. Lydia studied my expression carefully. There it is, she whispered. I grabbed the dish towel from the counter. You need to leave. Or what? I'll tell Eric everything. For the first time, her composure flickered, just briefly. Then she smiled again. You really think he'd believe you over me? That answer came too fast, too prepared. I finally understood the real danger standing in my kitchen. This wasn't reckless attraction. It was calculated dependency. Lydia had spent years building herself into the emotional center of every room she entered. People protected her instinctively because protecting her validated the version of themselves they preferred seeing. Generous husband, supportive sister, loyal family member. Charming people rarely manipulate individuals first. They manipulate social gravity. Claire entered the kitchen before I could answer. There you two are. Lydia stepped away instantly, expression perfectly relaxed. Daniel was lecturing me about overcooking roast beef. Claire laughed softly. Well, he's been monitoring meat temperatures since 1998. I forced a smile. That's another thing older men become good at. Performing normalcy while emotionally hemorrhaging underneath. Later that night, after everyone finally left, Claire and I prepared for bed quietly. No argument, no confrontation, just familiar routines. She moisturized her hands at the bathroom sink, while I wound my old wristwatch beside the mirror. The same silver watch my father gave me when I turned 30. Still ticking, he'd said back then, as if endurance itself were a virtue. Claire glanced at me through the mirror. You seem distracted lately. There it was again. Not accusation, observation, which somehow felt worse. Work's been busy. You've been retired for 8 months. I looked down at the watch in my hands. Retirement. Even now, the word felt unnatural. 40 years as a structural maintenance supervisor at the shipping yards. 40 years solving emergencies before sunrise while everyone else slept safely inside buildings. Men like me kept standing. Then one farewell cake, one watch plaque, one handshake. Suddenly, the world no longer required your daily existence. Retirement doesn't damage men because they stop working. It damages them because usefulness was often the only language people consistently rewarded them for speaking. "I'm adjusting," I said finally. Claire nodded slowly, but her eyes lingered on me another second too long, as if she were searching for something, or confirming something already suspected. That night, I dreamed about my father. Not unusual lately. In the dream, he sat silently at the kitchen table from my childhood home while rain hit the windows outside. He kept repairing the same broken clock over and over, never speaking. When I finally asked what he was fixing, he looked at me and said, "The moment they stopped needing me." Then I woke up. 3:13 in the morning, Claire asleep beside me. The house silent except for the ticking hallway clock downstairs. I couldn't fall back asleep, so I went down to the kitchen and sat alone in darkness with only the stove light glowing softly above the counters. There's a particular loneliness that arrives in houses after midnight. Every room feels like evidence of years already spent. Every object carries fingerprints of earlier versions of your life. Family photographs lined the hallway wall nearby. Michael graduating college, Emily holding newborn Noah, Claire smiling beside me during our 25th anniversary trip to Maine. I stared at those pictures for a long time, trying to locate precisely when emotional distance first entered the family. But betrayal rarely begins where people think it does. It starts in neglected conversations, accumulated exhaustion, years of small dismissals nobody considers important enough to mention. By morning, I'd decided something. I was going to speak privately with Eric, not accuse Lydia outright, just enough to warn him carefully. He deserved that much. My younger brother had protected me our entire childhood. When our father drank too heavily, Eric used to distract him with questions just to give me time to leave the room. People forget brothers, remember versions of each other nobody else ever sees. I called him around noon. "You busy tonight?" A pause. "Depends. You want to grab dinner?" Another pause, longer this time. "Actually," he cleared his throat. "Tonight's probably not good." Something tightened quietly in my chest. "You okay?" "Yeah, just tired." His voice sounded strange, careful, like someone choosing each word while walking through broken glass. "We should talk sometime," I said. "About what?" There it was, too fast, too defensive. I stared out the kitchen window at rainwater sliding down the fence outside. "Nothing serious," Eric exhaled softly. Then he said something that chilled me instantly. "Claire mentioned you've been under a lot of stress lately." My grip tightened around the phone. "What does that mean?" "She's worried about you." The room suddenly felt colder, not because of what he said, because Claire and Eric had apparently discussed me privately. Without me knowing, I thought about the dinner table, the strange glances, the careful pauses. Something larger was already moving underneath the family surface. "I'm fine," I answered carefully. "Good." Silence. Then, "You know Lydia can be friendly sometimes." There it was, not direct, not explicit, but unmistakable. My own brother was warning me about his wife, in the tone someone uses while discussing a dangerous animal, carefully, nervously, as if he already feared where this could lead. "I know exactly how Lydia can be," I said quietly. Another silence followed. Then Eric lowered his voice. "Just don't give people reasons to misunderstand things." The sentence hit harder than shouting would have, because buried underneath it was something devastating. He already suspected me. Maybe not fully, maybe not consciously, but enough for doubt to exist. And once doubt enters a family, every interaction becomes evidence. I almost told him everything right there. About the basement, the notes, the touching, the manipulation. But then I imagined Lydia crying, Claire confused and embarrassed, Michael quietly judging me, Emily refusing to let the grandchildren visit until things settled down. That's the cruel thing about family accusations involving men. Even innocence feels ugly defending itself. I should go, Eric muttered. Eric. Yeah, I closed my eyes briefly. Then I made the mistake that would haunt me later. I protected the peace instead of the truth. Nothing's going on, I said. His relief arrived too quickly. Good, good. We hung up seconds later. I sat motionless at the kitchen table afterward, staring at the old scratch marks in the wood left by Michael's toy cars decades earlier. A father spends half his life protecting his family from outside threats. Very few realize the real danger begins once protection becomes expected instead of appreciated. That evening, Claire left her phone charging on the counter while showering upstairs. I wasn't looking for anything. At least that's what I told myself. But the screen lit up with a text preview before I could look away. Lydia, he's getting suspicious. You need to decide how you want to handle this before he says something reckless. My pulse slowed, not quickened, slowed. The way it does right before a car accident, when your body suddenly understands impact, is unavoidable. Then another message appeared beneath it. Claire, I know. I'm trying to keep things calm until we're sure. Sure of what? That question echoed through my skull, while rain battered softly against the kitchen windows. Upstairs, the shower still ran, and downstairs, standing alone beside my wife's glowing phone, I realized I might already be losing my family to a story I never even participated in. I didn't confront Claire about the messages. Not that night. Maybe a younger man would have marched upstairs, immediately demanding explanations. Maybe he would have slammed the phone onto the bathroom counter while steam still filled the mirror. But age changes the way men react to danger. You stop charging toward explosions once you've survived enough of them. Instead, you listen carefully for where the walls are weakest. So I put the phone back exactly where it had been and sat down at the kitchen table. The clock above the stove read 9:41. Rainwater slid slowly down the dark windows while the refrigerator hummed softly behind me. Somewhere upstairs, pipes creaked as Claire turned off the shower. I remember staring at the bowl of unopened oranges in the center of the table. Such an ordinary thing. That's what felt unbearable. The world continues looking painfully normal, even when your life quietly begins collapsing underneath you. A minute later, Claire walked downstairs wearing gray pajamas and drying her hair with a towel. "You okay?" she asked. I looked up slowly. 32 years together, and suddenly, I couldn't tell whether I truly knew the woman standing in front of me, just tired. She nodded and opened the refrigerator. "You didn't eat much dinner." "Wasn't hungry." Claire poured herself tea while avoiding eye contact, just slightly too carefully. Tiny things become enormous once suspicion enters a marriage. The way someone pauses before answering. The way they suddenly become gentle. The way they study your mood before speaking. "Eric called earlier," she said casually. There it was. I kept my face neutral. "Yeah." He seemed worried. "About what?" She stirred sugar into her tea. "You." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because manipulation becomes surreal once you see the machinery underneath it. A week ago, I was simply a tired husband drifting quietly through retirement. Now invisible conversations were happening around me. Quiet alliances forming behind closed doors. People preparing emotional narratives before I even understood there was a war. Claire finally looked at me directly. "Daniel, is there something you need to tell me?" The question settled heavily between us. I thought about the text messages. He's getting suspicious. I know. I'm trying to keep things calm until we're sure. Sure of what? That I wanted Lydia? That I'd done something inappropriate? That I was emotionally unstable? The possibilities moved through my head like cold water. "No," I answered carefully. Claire studied me for another second. Then she nodded, but not convincingly, and that frightened me more than anger would have. Distrust grows quietly inside long marriages because older couples often stop fighting for clarity. We become tired of emotional labor, tired of unpacking every misunderstanding completely. So suspicion survives in half-finished conversations. By midnight, Claire was asleep again. I wasn't. I sat in the downstairs den beside the old bookshelf I built 20 years earlier, when Emily was still in high school. Family photo albums lined the bottom shelf, tax records, retirement paperwork, insurance documents. Evidence of an entire lifetime spent building stability for other people. I poured myself coffee I didn't want and opened one of the photo albums. Eric and I at 12 and 14 holding fishing rods beside our father's truck. Claire pregnant with Michael. Emily asleep on my chest in a recliner while I wore my old shipping yard uniform. A father slowly disappears inside photographs. At first, you're centered. Then gradually, you become the one holding the camera. Around 1:30 in the morning, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Then another message arrived. "We need to talk privately before this gets worse. Lydia." No greeting, no explanation, just control. I stared at the screen for a long time before typing back, "Do not contact me again." 3 dots appeared instantly. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." I didn't answer. Another message arrived. "Claire already thinks something happened." That sentence hollowed something inside my chest. Not because it confirmed betrayal, because it confirmed strategy. Lydia wasn't improvising anymore. She was steering, and somehow, my wife was already emotionally inside the current. I deleted the messages immediately afterward, then sat motionless in the dark den, listening to the house settle around me. Older homes make strange noises at night. Small creaks in floorboards, pipes shifting inside walls, gentle ticking from vents cooling after heat cycles end. When children are young, those sounds make a house feel alive. When families begin breaking apart, the same sounds feel like witnesses. The next morning, Claire barely spoke during breakfast. Not cold, not hostile, careful. That word kept returning to me. Careful people already believe something dangerous exists. At 10, Emily called asking if I could watch Noah Saturday afternoon while she attended a work seminar. Normally, she asked weeks in advance. This time, her voice carried hesitation. "Only if you're not busy." "I'm retired," I answered quietly. "I'm always available." A pause. Then she said something strange. "Mom says you've been under a lot of pressure lately." There it was again. The same phrase moving through the family like a rehearsed line. Pressure, stress, emotional distance. Vague enough to sound compassionate, specific enough to imply concern. I suddenly realized what Lydia was building. Not an accusation, a profile. She wasn't telling people I'd done something wrong. She was establishing that I was emotionally unstable enough to potentially do something wrong, planting context before conflict. The realization made my stomach turn. "Your mother worries too much," I said carefully. Emily laughed softly, but it sounded forced. "Yeah, Another pause. Then, you know you can talk to us if something's going on, right? Us. Not me, us. The family had already become a unit observing me from the outside. That's how fast emotional isolation happens. Once suspicion enters a household, you stop being a person, you become a situation. After the call ended, I went into the garage and sat alone beside my old toolbox. The metal was scratched and faded from decades of use. My father's initials, still carved faintly beneath the handle. I used to repair everything in this garage. Bikes, water heaters, broken chairs, lawn mowers. People brought me problems because they trusted my hands. Funny how quickly trust evaporates once emotion becomes involved. I opened the toolbox slowly. Inside, beneath loose screws and measuring tape, sat an old envelope I hadn't touched in years. My father's handwriting covered the front. For Daniel. I stared at it for a long time. He'd given it to me 2 weeks before he died, but told me not to open it unless I finally understood what marriage costs a man. At 37, I thought he sounded bitter. At 58, I wasn't so certain. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single handwritten page. The paper smelled faintly of dust and old cedar. A man can survive being unloved longer than he can survive being misunderstood. That was the first sentence. I read it 3 times, then continued. Families rarely destroy fathers all at once. They do it slowly, by turning his sacrifices into expectations, his patience into weakness, his silence into evidence that he feels nothing at all. Outside, wind rattled softly against the garage door. I kept reading. The most dangerous person in a family is not the loudest one. It is the person who quietly controls perception. I stopped breathing for a moment, because suddenly I wasn't reading my father's words anymore. I was reading my own life unfolding decades later. Before I could continue, my phone rang. Claire, I answered immediately. You okay? I asked. Silence. Then, where are you? Garage. Another pause. You need to come inside. Something in her voice made my pulse tighten instantly. Not anger, fear. Real fear. I stood up quickly. What happened? Claire lowered her voice. Eric's here. I frowned. So, he's upset. Cold spread slowly through my chest. What did Lydia say? She told him you've been making her uncomfortable for months. The garage suddenly felt airless. I gripped the workbench hard enough for my knuckles to ache. She what? She said you stare at her, text her late at night, cornered her in the basement. Every word arrived carefully prepared. Every word chosen because it sounded believable without sounding dramatic. I closed my eyes briefly. Basement, of course. That's why she staged it there. No witnesses, private setting, just enough ambiguity. Claire, she didn't want to tell anyone, Claire interrupted quickly. But Eric pushed her because she's been anxious around family gatherings. Anxious. I almost admired the precision, not terrified, not assaulted, just emotionally uncomfortable. The kind of accusation impossible to disprove without looking defensive. I never touched her. Silence answered me. Not disbelief. Worse, consideration. Claire was considering the possibility. 32 years together, and my wife was quietly evaluating whether I might be the kind of man who secretly pursued her sister. That's the cruel thing about long marriages. People think history guarantees trust. Sometimes, history simply gives suspicion more material to reinterpret. Please come inside, Claire whispered. I heard low voices in the background. Eric talking. Pacing maybe. Then something crashed faintly. Glass. I'm coming. I hung up slowly. My father's letter still lay open on the workbench beside me. A man can survive being unloved longer than he can survive being misunderstood. For the first time in my life, I finally understood exactly what he meant. I stayed in the garage another minute before going inside. Not because I was afraid of Eric, because I understood something irreversible had already happened. Once a family begins discussing you in lowered voices, you stop being fully human to them. You become an emotional problem requiring management, and problems are rarely granted the benefit of dignity. I folded my father's letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope before closing the toolbox. My hands looked steady. That surprised me. I'd always imagined betrayal would feel explosive when it finally arrived, like shouting, broken dishes, some dramatic moment where the entire world visibly changes shape. Instead, it felt administrative, quiet, like paperwork being processed behind closed doors. The kitchen lights were still on when I entered through the garage door. Claire stood near the sink, wringing her hands together, while Eric paced beside the dining table. He looked terrible, eyes bloodshot, beard uneven, shirt half untucked like he'd dressed during an argument. For a second, I saw my younger brother again beneath all the exhaustion. The same boy who used to split sandwiches in half for me when our father forgot groceries. Then he looked at me, and whatever remained of that memory vanished. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he asked. Claire flinched immediately. I closed the garage door quietly behind me. "Eric, no." His voice cracked sharply. "You don't get to calm your way out of this. Calm your way out of this." Interesting phrase. Even now, my composure offended him more than the accusation itself. People become suspicious of restraint once they've emotionally committed to outrage. "I have never touched your wife," I said carefully. "You cornered her downstairs. She cornered me." Eric laughed bitterly. "There it is." "What?" "The wording," he pointed at me. "You already sound defensive." I looked at Claire. She couldn't meet my eyes. That hurt more than Eric yelling. Because silence from strangers means nothing. Silence from someone who once knew your heartbeat by touch can hollow out an entire life. "Did she tell you she sent me notes?" I asked. Eric froze briefly. Then anger returned even harder. "You're unbelievable. She's lying." "You think I don't know Lydia flirts sometimes?" he snapped. "You think I'm stupid?" That caught me off guard, not the admission, the exhaustion underneath it. Eric already knew exactly who his wife was. That realization changed something fundamental in the room. "She makes people uncomfortable," he continued. "Sometimes she crosses lines socially, but that doesn't mean you get to." "I didn't do anything. And why would she say this?" "Because she was rejected. Because some people experience rejection as humiliation instead of disappointment. Because manipulative people often destroy the version of reality that wounded their ego." But I didn't say any of that. Because another realization was settling into place now. It wouldn't matter. Once emotional narratives begin spreading through families, facts become secondary to personality. People stop asking what happened and start asking which version feels emotionally easier to live with. And Lydia had prepared the ground carefully. Stressed lately, emotionally distant, acting strange. All those small conversations suddenly snapped together like puzzle pieces. Claire finally spoke softly. "Daniel, did you text her?" I stared at my wife. "She texted me." "Late at night?" "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me?" There it was, not trust, procedure. I had violated procedure by failing to report manipulation quickly enough. I was trying to avoid destroying the family. Eric laughed harshly again. Too late for that. The grandfather clock ticked heavily in the hallway. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Eric asked the question that finally made me understand how badly things had already spread. "Did anything happen before Thanksgiving?" I blinked. "What?" Claire looked startled too. Eric rubbed his face tiredly. She said you've been acting weird around her for months. Months. My stomach tightened. Revision. That's how accusations gain power. They rewrite earlier neutral moments into suspicious ones. Suddenly, every glance becomes loaded. Every silence becomes evidence retroactively. No, I answered flatly. Eric looked unconvinced. Not fully convinced of my guilt either. That was the tragedy. He looked like a man drowning between two terrible possibilities. Either his wife was lying, or his brother wanted her. Both versions destroyed him. People rarely talk about collateral damage inside families. How betrayal forces impossible emotional math onto everyone nearby. Claire stepped closer to me finally. Why didn't you tell me about the basement conversation? The room went still. I looked at her carefully. She told you about that part? Claire hesitated. Yes. Did she mention she said you already suspected me of something? Claire's face changed instantly. Just slightly. Enough. She told you that, she whispered. There are messages on your phone, Claire. Eric looked between us sharply. What messages? Claire's face paled. Now we were finally approaching the truth. Not the whole truth, but enough to make people nervous. She texted you too? Eric asked. Claire swallowed. She was worried. About what? Neither of us answered immediately. That silence said more than words. Eric stared at Claire slowly, then at me. The first real crack appeared in his certainty. What exactly has she been telling everybody? Nobody spoke. Rain hammered harder against the windows. Somewhere upstairs, pipes creaked softly through the walls. Then Eric muttered something almost too quiet to hear. She did this before. Claire looked up immediately. What? Eric sat heavily in one of the dining chairs, suddenly looking much older than 53. Not like this exactly. He rubbed his eyes hard. In Chicago, before we moved back, cold moved slowly through my chest. There was a guy at her gym, Eric continued. She said he kept flirting with her, following her around. Claire crossed her arms tightly. What happened? He got banned from the gym. Eric laughed once bitterly. Then, 6 months later, Lydia admitted maybe she'd misread his energy. Amazing how gently attractive people are allowed to rewrite damage. I sat down slowly across from him. What really happened? Eric stared at the table. She flirted with him first. Silence swallowed the room. Claire looked physically ill now. But by the time she admitted it, Eric whispered, everyone already thought he was some creep obsessed with her. Nobody moved. The clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Ordinary household sounds surrounding extraordinary collapse. You should have told me, Claire said quietly to Eric. He looked up with hollow eyes. You think I wasn't embarrassed? That sentence landed heavily because it carried something painfully human underneath it. People protect manipulative spouses sometimes because admitting the truth humiliates them too. A marriage built around managing chaos slowly trains both people to normalize emotional dishonesty. I finally understood why Eric looked so exhausted lately. He wasn't just surviving Lydia. He was surviving the constant maintenance required to keep believing in her. Claire sat down slowly beside me. For the first time all evening, her shoulder touched mine lightly. Tiny contact. But after the emotional distance growing between us lately, it felt enormous. You should shown me the messages, she whispered. I know, and the notes. I know. She looked at me then, really looked at me, not as a situation, not as a concern, as her husband again. That nearly broke me, because older men don't realize how starved they've become for simple belief until someone finally offers it back. Eric suddenly stood again. I need to talk to her. His voice sounded dangerous now, not violent. Worse, certain. He grabbed his coat from the chair. Claire rose quickly. Maybe wait until morning. No, Eric, she's been doing this for years. The grief in his voice filled the kitchen. Not grief for the accusation. Grief for the realization that he already knew his wife was capable of it. That's the devastating thing about denial. When it finally collapses, it forces you to re-examine entire decades, honestly. Eric looked at me awkwardly then, ashamed. I don't know what to believe anymore. I do, I answered quietly. He nodded faintly, then left. The front door closed hard behind him. Rain roared outside. Claire and I stood silently in the kitchen afterward, like survivors examining wreckage. Finally, she whispered, "I'm sorry," 2 words, soft, exhausted, human. And yet they didn't fully heal anything. Because apologies cannot erase the moment someone you love quietly considered whether you were capable of betraying them. Trust doesn't break loudly after 30 years. It fractures internally like old wood. You can still stand on it afterward, but you never stop hearing the crack. Claire reached for my hand carefully. "I didn't want to believe it," she admitted. "But you did." Tears gathered in her eyes immediately. "That's not fair." "No," I said quietly. "It isn't," she cried then. Not dramatically. Just tired tears from a tired woman realizing her marriage had wandered dangerously close to destruction, without either of us noticing how vulnerable we'd become. I wanted to comfort her. Instead, I looked toward the dark hallway where our family photographs still hung peacefully against the wall. Perfect frozen moments, smiling birthdays, graduations, anniversaries, evidence of all the years we'd spent building a life together. And suddenly, I understood something devastating about families. Most collapses don't begin with hatred. They begin with emotional neglect, creating empty spaces, large enough for manipulation to move inside. Claire squeezed my hand softly. "We'll fix this," I almost answered. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket. One new message, unknown number again. "You just made a very serious mistake." I stared at the screen silently, while rain battered the house harder outside, and deep in my chest. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something colder than fear begin settling into place. I didn't show Claire the message. Not immediately. She was still standing close enough for me to smell her lavender hand lotion, still holding onto my wrist gently, like she was afraid I might disappear if she loosened her grip. Maybe part of me wanted to preserve that moment a little longer. Because after weeks of suspicion drifting silently through the house, the simple fact that my wife was touching me again felt almost disorienting. Funny what men become grateful for after enough emotional drought. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. Claire wiped beneath her eyes carefully. "You should come to bed." I looked toward the front window, where rainwater distorted the streetlights outside. Eric's going to confront her. I know, that won't end quietly. Claire closed her eyes briefly. No, there was history inside that single word. Years of excuses. Family gatherings rearranged around Lydia's moods. Little crises everyone pretended were temporary, even after they became patterns. Families normalize instability slowly. That's why it survives so long. We went upstairs without speaking much more. The bedroom felt unfamiliar somehow, like we were stepping back into a place we'd neglected for years. Claire changed into an old college t-shirt while I sat on the edge of the bed, removing my watch carefully. "You still wind that thing every night," she said softly. "My father wore it every day for 30 years. He loved that watch more than most people." I almost smiled. Probably trusted it more. Claire gave me a tired look. "You sound like him lately." That stopped me, because she didn't mean it kindly. My father had become difficult near the end of his life. Suspicious, withdrawn, quiet in ways that made rooms uncomfortable. As a teenager, I used to think he enjoyed emotional distance. Now I wondered whether he'd simply stopped believing anyone wanted the truth from him anymore. Claire climbed into bed slowly. I should have trusted you immediately. I loosened the watch band carefully in my hands. You trusted the possibility. Her face tightened. That's different. No, I said quietly. It isn't. Silence settled between us. Heavy, not angry, just painfully honest. After a while, she whispered, "She's my sister." There it was. The real wound underneath everything. People always imagine betrayal as choosing one person over another. Usually it's choosing between two impossible griefs. Claire had spent her entire life protecting Lydia in small ways. Cleaning up awkward moments socially, explaining sharp comments, translating selfishness into stress or misunderstandings. Older sisters often become emotional janitors for younger siblings who never grow up properly. I know, I answered finally. Claire stared at the ceiling. She wasn't always like this. Yes, she was. The words escaped before I could soften them. Claire looked at me sharply, and I realized something important. The family had spent decades editing Lydia into a more acceptable version of herself. Everyone participating unconsciously, because confronting the full truth would require dismantling years of carefully maintained narratives. She was charming when we were young, Claire whispered defensively. She still is. That's not what I mean. I know. Claire rolled onto her side away from me. For a moment, she looked suddenly much older than 56. Smaller somehow. There were signs, she admitted quietly. I just kept thinking she'd grow out of things. People say that about manipulative adults all the time, as if selfishness matures naturally into empathy. Usually, it just becomes more sophisticated. Around midnight, my phone buzzed again, then again. 3 messages in total. I ignored them. But Claire noticed. Is that her? Yes. You should block the number. I stared at the dark screen. No. Claire frowned slightly. Why not? Because evidence matters once people start rewriting reality. Because men accused of emotional misconduct quickly learn memory alone is worthless. But I didn't say that aloud. Instead, I placed the phone face down on the nightstand. I just don't want surprises anymore. Claire nodded slowly. Then she reached across the bed and rested her hand lightly over mine. The gesture nearly undid me, not because it was romantic, because it felt familiar. And familiarity can become heartbreaking once you realize how long you've lived without it. Aging inside marriage is strange. Physical intimacy fades gradually enough that most couples barely discuss it. One day, you simply realize months have passed since your spouse touched you with tenderness instead of habit. Then years. Loneliness inside marriage doesn't arrive dramatically. It accumulates quietly in untouched shoulders and unfinished conversations. Claire fell asleep eventually, I didn't. At 1:17 a.m., the phone rang. Eric. I answered immediately and stepped into the hallway before speaking. You okay? Breathing heavy, uneven. Then she admitted it. Cold traveled through my chest. All of it? No, he laughed bitterly. Not really. I leaned against the hallway wall beneath the framed photographs. What happened? Another long breath. I asked about the basement first. And she said you misunderstood her being friendly. Of course. Then I asked why she told Claire you were making her uncomfortable. Silence. I could picture him standing somewhere alone in his house, while Lydia constructed explanations around him like smoke. What did she say? That she panicked. His voice cracked slightly. She said she thought you were developing feelings for her and wanted to create distance before things escalated. There it was. The reversal, elegant, defensive, plausible. Manipulative people rarely deny events entirely once evidence appears. They simply reposition themselves as the responsible victim managing someone else's inappropriate emotions. She's lying. I know. The exhaustion in his voice frightened me. Not rage, collapse. Where is she now? I asked. Guest room. I closed my eyes briefly. Their house suddenly felt very clear in my imagination. Dark hallway lights. Separate breathing behind separate doors. Decades of marriage quietly splitting down the middle. Eric, she cried, Daniel. The sentence arrived broken. She cried so hard I almost apologized to her. That's how emotional manipulation survives. Not because it's convincing logically, because human beings instinctively move toward visible distress. The loudest pain often controls the room. She told me she felt ashamed, he continued quietly. Said she never meant for any of this to happen. I rubbed my forehead tiredly. And did she apologize for lying? A pause. No, of course not. Because apologies create accountability. Manipulators prefer ambiguity, confusion, emotional fog thick enough that everyone eventually accepts partial blame just to restore peace. Eric suddenly whispered, "What if I made her this way?" That question nearly broke my heart, because I recognized it immediately. The exhausted spouse's final stage of denial. Self-blame feels safer than admitting you spent years loving someone willing to distort reality for emotional control. You didn't, I answered firmly. You don't know that. I do. He went silent again. Then quietly, she said you looked lonely. I stared down the dark hallway. She studied you, he continued. Said you and Claire drifted apart years ago. The frightening thing was that part wasn't entirely false. That's what made Lydia effective. She weaponized emotional truths, not invented stories. Claire and I had drifted. Retirement had isolated me more than I admitted. I had become quieter, more withdrawn. Manipulation works best when it wraps itself around existing fractures. She noticed weakness, I said finally. No, Eric's voice sounded hollow. She noticed hunger. That sentence stayed with me long after the call ended, because he was right. Older men rarely talk about emotional hunger. Society grants us responsibility, but not vulnerability. We're expected to provide stability indefinitely, while pretending our own need for affection. Expired sometime around middle age, but deprivation doesn't disappear, it just becomes embarrassing. At 2:30 in the morning, I went downstairs for water. The house sat silent around me. Moonlight filtered faintly through rain-streaked windows, while the grandfather clock ticked near the staircase. I poured a glass slowly and noticed Claire's phone, still charging beside the fruit bowl. One unread message glowed faintly on the lock screen. Lydia, don't let him manipulate you too. I stared at it for several seconds. Then another message appeared immediately beneath it. You know how emotionally cold he's become. My chest tightened slowly. There it was again. Not accusation, character assassination, quiet erosion. She wasn't trying to prove I pursued her anymore. She was reframing my entire identity inside the family. Cold, distant, manipulative. The dangerous husband whose quietness concealed darker intentions. I suddenly realized Lydia wasn't just protecting herself. She was punishing rejection. That changed everything. Because wounded vanity eventually escalates beyond self-preservation. I took screenshots of the messages using my phone, then carefully placed Claire's phone exactly where it had been. Upstairs, floorboards creaked softly. Claire moving in bed maybe, or waking. I remained motionless in the dark kitchen, listening to the house breathe around me. And another realization settled into place. This wasn't ending soon. Even if the accusation faded publicly, something permanent had already entered the family. A fracture, a reinterpretation of me that could never fully be erased. People might forgive. They might even believe me. But somewhere deep inside future family gatherings, a small question would always survive. What if there was some truth to it? That's the cruelty of false, emotional allegations inside families. Innocence doesn't restore the original version of yourself afterward. It only creates a less damaged replacement. I turned off the kitchen light and stood alone in darkness for a moment. The hallway photographs barely visible now. Decades of smiles frozen behind glass. And for the first time in my life, I began seriously wondering whether holding a family together was always worth the cost fathers paid to do it. The following week felt like living inside a house after a small fire. Nothing completely destroyed, but every room smelled faintly wrong. Claire tried harder with me. I noticed it immediately. Morning coffee already prepared before I woke up. Small touches on my shoulder while passing behind me in the kitchen. Questions about my day she hadn't asked in months. At another time, those gestures might healed something. Now they only revealed how absent they'd been. That's the danger of delayed affection. Once emotional starvation has been noticed, kindness can start feeling corrective instead of natural. Tuesday afternoon, she asked if I wanted to go with her to the grocery store. We hadn't done that together willingly in years. Usually, one of us went alone because it was easier. Sure, I answered. The relief on her face hurt to see, as if my agreement confirmed the marriage was still salvageable. Maybe it was. But restoration and repair aren't the same thing. A repaired plate still remembers the crack. The grocery store smelled like floor cleaner and ripe fruit. Fluorescent lights reflected harshly against polished tile, while older couples wandered slowly through aisles discussing soup brands and blood pressure medication. I used to find places like that depressing. Lately, they just felt honest. Claire pushed the cart while reading a shopping list from her phone. Emily says Noah's cough is better. That's good. She might bring the kids Sunday. I nodded. Small conversation. Careful conversation. Married people become diplomats after enough damage. Near the dairy section, Claire stopped suddenly. Lydia stood 20 feet away beside the yogurt refrigerators. Alone. For a second, nobody moved. Then Lydia smiled softly and approached us. The composure stunned me. No embarrassment. No hesitation. Just smooth emotional adjustment, like a woman arriving at a luncheon after being slightly delayed. "Hey," she said gently. Claire's posture tightened immediately. "What are you doing here?" "Shopping." Lydia glanced toward me briefly before looking back at her sister. "I've been calling you. I needed space." The smile faded slightly. "I understand." "No, you don't," I thought immediately. People like Lydia rarely understand boundaries emotionally. They understand them strategically. Claire gripped the shopping cart harder. "Eric told me what happened, a tiny pause. Not fear, calculation. He told you his version. There shouldn't be versions." Lydia sighed quietly, attracting sympathetic glances from nearby strangers instantly. That's another skill manipulative people develop. Public vulnerability, calibrated precisely enough to look authentic from a distance. "I never wanted any of this," she whispered. "You accused my husband. I said he made me uncomfortable. You implied he wanted you." Lydia finally looked directly at me, long enough for old tension to flicker briefly underneath her calm expression. Then she lowered her eyes carefully. "I thought he did." There it was again. Not a lie easily disproven, just emotional interpretation. Manipulators survive by operating inside ambiguity. Claire shook her head slowly. You texted me constantly for weeks. I was scared. Of what? Lydia's eyes filled with tears almost instantly. That speed frightened me more than anger would have. Claire, please. Nearby shoppers were starting to notice now. Not enough to hear details, just enough to observe emotional discomfort. Lydia understood public optics instinctively. She stepped closer to her sister. I already told Eric I handled things badly. That's not an apology. Her face crumpled slightly. What do you want from me? Truth, I thought. But truth is useless once people become emotionally invested in their own innocence. Claire looked exhausted suddenly. Older. I want you to leave us alone for a while. The words landed harder than shouting could have. For the first time since this began, Lydia lost composure completely. Just for a second. But I saw it. A flash of cold fury underneath the tears. Possession interrupted. Control denied. Then the mask returned. Okay, she whispered softly. She turned to leave, then paused beside me. Close enough that only I could hear her final sentence. You think this makes you safe now? My stomach tightened. Before I could answer, she walked away calmly through the fluorescent aisles, carrying nothing in her basket but bottled water and paper towels. Claire stood frozen beside the cart afterward. You okay? I asked quietly. She nodded too fast. No. We finished shopping in near silence. Outside, cold wind swept wrappers across the parking lot, while clouds gathered low and gray overhead. Claire loaded groceries into the trunk mechanically, avoiding my eyes. Finally, she whispered. I saw her face change. I closed the trunk carefully. So did I. Claire leaned against the car door, looking suddenly fragile. She scared me. That sentence mattered, because until then, Claire had still been operating partly inside sisterhood, inside history, inside old emotional obligations. Fear changed the equation. She's always needed attention, Claire murmured. But this, she lost control. Claire looked at me carefully then. Do you think she really believed you had feelings for her? The question lingered between us painfully. Because the answer required honesty, neither of us fully wanted. I think, I said slowly. She noticed our marriage was lonely. Claire flinched almost imperceptibly. That tiny reaction told me everything. She knew too. Maybe she'd known for years. Long marriages often decay quietly because both people sense the distance growing, but fear naming it aloud. Once spoken, loneliness becomes real. I'm sorry, she whispered again. This time I didn't answer immediately. Not to punish her, because I suddenly felt exhausted in a way sleep couldn't repair. When fathers grow emotionally tired, families often interpret it as moodiness or aging. Very few recognize the exhaustion comes from carrying invisible emotional architecture for decades. Keeping peace, absorbing tension, fixing problems quietly before anyone notices them. Eventually, the structure starts collapsing inward. That evening, Michael stopped by unexpectedly. He arrived carrying takeout containers and forced cheerfulness. Thought you guys might not feel like cooking. Claire hugged him too tightly at the door. Our son looked uncomfortable immediately. Adult children hate sensing fractures between parents. It forces them to realize the stability of childhood was always more fragile than they understood. We ate Chinese food around the dining room table, while rain tapped steadily against the windows again. Michael avoided mentioning Lydia at first. Then finally, Mom told me things got complicated. Families love soft words for sharp injuries. Claire folded her napkin carefully. Your aunt lied about your father. Michael glanced at me awkwardly. I figured something was off. How? I asked quietly. He hesitated, then shrugged. Dad, you barely flirt with waitresses. I almost laughed despite everything. Claire smiled faintly too, small relief moving briefly through the room. Then Michael said something that changed the atmosphere instantly. But Emily's still unsure. Silence. My fork stopped halfway to the plate. What do you mean, unsure? Michael rubbed the back of his neck uncomfortably. She believes you probably didn't do anything serious. Probably. Interesting word. Claire stared at him sharply. She knows Lydia manipulates people. Yeah, but... He exhaled slowly. Emotional affairs happen. The sentence hit like cold water, because there it was. The permanent stain. Not predator, not monster, just emotionally inappropriate. Believable enough to survive. I never had feelings for Lydia, I said flatly. Michael raised both hands immediately. I know, but he didn't know. Not fully, because certainty had already been contaminated. That's how these situations poison families. Absolute trust downgrades into probability. Probably innocent. Probably misunderstood. Probably nothing happened. Probabilities leave permanent residue. Claire looked furious now. You don't get to halfway believe this. I'm trying to be realistic. About your father? Michael looked down at the table. You guys were distant for a long time. The room went very still. Children notice more than parents realize, not details. Atmosphere, he continued carefully. I'm not blaming either of you. I just mean, people get lonely. There was that word again, lonely. The entire disaster orbiting that single truth. I suddenly remembered Lydia in the basement. You're lonely, Daniel. At the time, it felt manipulative. Now I understood why it had unsettled me so deeply. Because manipulative people often weaponize truths nobody else dares say aloud. Claire pushed back from the table abruptly. I need some air. She left for the back porch without another word. Michael sighed heavily once the door closed. I shouldn't have said that. No, I answered quietly. You should have. He looked surprised. Rain drummed softly overhead, while cold wind slipped through the slight opening in the porch door. My son studied me carefully. You really were unhappy. I leaned back slowly in the dining chair. That's not the same thing as wanting another woman. I know. But again, not certainty, only hope. I stared toward the dark porch window, where Claire's silhouette stood motionless outside. When men reach a certain age, I said quietly, people stop asking whether they feel loved. They only ask whether they're behaving properly. Michael didn't answer, because he knew exactly what I meant. Families often reduce fathers into functions, so gradually nobody notices it happening. Provider, fixer, grandfather, retirement helper, emergency contact. Meanwhile, the actual man underneath those responsibilities slowly starves emotionally in plain sight. I never wanted Lydia, I continued, but I was lonely enough for her attention to feel dangerous. That honesty cost something to admit aloud. Michael absorbed it silently, then quietly asked, "Does Mom know that?" I looked toward the porch again, at my wife standing alone beneath dim yellow light while rain blurred the darkness beyond her. And for the first time since this began, I honestly didn't know whether either of us truly understood how much damage had already existed before Lydia ever touched my wrist in that kitchen months earlier. Claire stayed on the porch nearly 20 minutes. Michael eventually gathered the empty takeout containers and carried them quietly into the kitchen, while I sat alone at the dining table staring at condensation sliding down my untouched water glass. The house felt suspended, not peaceful, paused, like everyone inside it understood some deeper conversation was approaching. But nobody wanted to be the first to begin it. Michael rinsed containers beneath the faucet without looking at me. When I was a kid, he said carefully, I used to think you and Mom had the perfect marriage. I almost smiled. That's because children mistake stability for happiness. He nodded slowly. I guess I do that with my own marriage now. There was exhaustion in his voice I hadn't noticed before. Funny how fathers miss their sons becoming tired men themselves. You and Rachel okay? Michael shrugged. Mostly. Another marriage surviving inside partial honesty. He dried his hands and leaned against the counter. Can I ask you something? Sure. Why didn't you ever tell Mom you were unhappy? The question settled heavily into the room because the truthful answer sounded pathetic when spoken aloud. Men raised in my generation learned early that emotional discomfort was something you managed privately. You worked harder, stayed busy, fixed things around the house, endured. Loneliness wasn't considered an emergency. I didn't think it mattered, I admitted finally. Michael frowned. How could it not matter? I looked toward the porch door again. Because your mother wasn't cruel. She was tired too. That was the difficult thing. There had never been a villain inside my marriage before Lydia entered it. Just erosion. Years of responsibilities replacing tenderness. Michael stared at the floor quietly. I think Rachel and I are turning into roommates. The confession surprised both of us. He laughed awkwardly afterward, like he regretted saying it immediately. But I understood. Children rarely ask fathers for emotional advice until they suddenly realize they're becoming them. Do you still talk? I asked. About bills and schedules. No. I mean really talk. He didn't answer. That silence told me enough. I looked at my son carefully then. 30 years old already. Gray beginning near his temples. Stress hidden behind humor the same way I used to hide mine. Time moves strangely for fathers. One day you're teaching a boy to ride a bicycle. Then suddenly he's standing in your kitchen asking how marriages quietly die. People think love disappears dramatically, I said softly. Most of the time it just stops being prioritized. Michael listened closely. You stop touching each other casually. Stop noticing exhaustion. Stop asking certain questions because life gets busy. I paused. Then eventually somebody else notices the loneliness before you do. He understood immediately. That frightened him. Good. Some fears arrive too late to help. The porch door finally opened behind us. Claire stepped back inside, hugging her cardigan tightly around herself. Her eyes were red. Michael moved instantly toward her. You okay? She nodded too quickly again. I'm fine. Nobody believed her. She looked at me for a long moment before speaking. Can we talk alone? Michael grabbed his keys immediately. I should head out anyway. Claire hugged him tightly at the door. Longer than usual. Parents do that sometimes after emotional earthquakes. Cling unconsciously to whatever pieces of family still feel stable. Once he left and settled through the house again. Claire walked back toward the dining room slowly and sat across from me. The same table where we'd eaten thousands of meals together. Birthday cakes, homework dinners, holiday arguments, hospital phone calls. Life accumulates around tables. That's why difficult conversations always seem heavier there. Claire folded her hands carefully. Michael was right. I waited. We were lonely long before Lydia got involved. The honesty in her voice hurt. Because once truth finally enters a marriage, it illuminates years retroactively. I nodded slowly. Yes, tears filled her eyes again. I didn't notice how far apart we'd gotten until another woman stepped into the space between us. That sentence carried enormous shame. Not jealousy, failure. There's a particular grief middle-aged couples experience when they realize neglect wasn't sudden. It was mutual and gradual and preventable. I should fought for us sooner, she whispered. I stared at the scratches in the dining table wood. I should have told you I was disappearing. Claire broke then, not loudly, just quiet, exhausted, crying from someone finally confronting years honestly instead of functionally. I thought we were okay, she said through tears. Not happy maybe, but okay. Most dying marriages look okay from the outside. That was another painful truth age teaches. Disaster rarely announces itself in ordinary families. People keep attending work and paying mortgages and making dentist appointments, while emotional collapse quietly spreads underneath everything. Claire wiped her face shakily. Did you ever think about leaving me? The question surprised me, not because she asked it, because I realized I genuinely didn't know the answer anymore. I don't think I ever allowed myself to imagine another life, I admitted. Why? Because fathers don't really get to collapse. She stared at me silently. I continued before I could stop myself. When I was working, everybody needed something constantly. Money, repairs, advice, stability. I looked around the quiet house. Then retirement came, and suddenly I realized usefulness was the only version of me everyone consistently valued. Claire shook her head immediately. That's not true. Isn't it? The room went still, because both of us knew there was some truth inside it. Families often love fathers deeply, while still reducing them into support structures emotionally. The appreciation becomes functional instead of intimate, reliable, dependable, strong. Meanwhile, the actual human being underneath those qualities slowly disappears from view. Claire whispered, I did love you. Did, past tense. She heard it too. Her face crumpled immediately afterward. I mean, I know what you meant, but I did know, and maybe she did too. Love had existed once, warmly, naturally, easily. Now we were discussing its remains like archaeologists examining ruins. Claire stood suddenly and walked toward the hallway photographs. I watched her stare at them one by one. Emily's graduation, our trip to Maine, Christmas mornings. 32 years compressed into frames. We looked happy, she murmured. We probably were sometimes. That's not enough. No. Rain slid steadily down the windows behind her. The grandfather clock ticked softly nearby. Then Claire said something that changed the entire shape of the conversation. I was jealous of Lydia. I looked up sharply. She laughed bitterly through lingering tears. Not because of you, a pause. Because she still made people want things from her. The honesty stunned me. Claire turned toward me slowly. She walks into rooms and people notice her immediately. Men flirt. Women compete with her. She crossed her arms tightly. Meanwhile, I became practical. There it was. Another hidden loneliness. Wives disappear too sometimes. Not physically, emotionally. Motherhood. Bills, careers, routine. Gradually replacing the version of themselves that once felt desired instead of dependable. I stopped feeling like a woman years ago, Claire admitted quietly. I started feeling like infrastructure. That sentence settled deep inside me, because suddenly I understood the tragedy completely. We hadn't stopped loving each other all at once. We'd both simply become exhausted support systems living beside each other. Two people quietly starving while pretending functionality was enough. And into that starvation stepped Lydia, beautiful, attentive, emotionally invasive. A woman who built her entire identity around being wanted. She noticed us immediately, Claire whispered. Didn't she? Yes. Claire closed her eyes briefly. She knew exactly where the cracks were. I nodded. People like that always do. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then Claire walked back toward me slowly. I need you to answer one thing honestly. All right. If Lydia had kept pushing, if I never found out, her voice trembled, would you eventually have given in? The question hollowed the room instantly. I could have lied. Maybe that would have been kinder. But kindness built on dishonesty already nearly destroyed us once. I don't know, I answered quietly. Claire looked physically struck. I never wanted her, I continued quickly. But loneliness changes people. Tears slipped down her face again. Mine too, though more slowly. Because honesty between aging spouses often sounds less romantic than young people expect. Real marriages aren't destroyed by temptation alone. They're destroyed by emotional neglect convincing both people they no longer matter intimately to anyone. Claire sat beside me finally, instead of across from me, close enough for our knees to touch lightly beneath the table. I hate her, she whispered. I believed her. But hatred wasn't the heaviest feeling in the room anymore. Grief was. Grief for all the years we lost slowly without noticing. Upstairs, the house creaked softly as temperature dropped outside. Claire leaned against my shoulder carefully. The contact felt unfamiliar and ancient at the same time. Then my phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. I checked the screen. You should ask Claire why she suddenly became interested in saving her marriage after all these years. I stared at the message silently. Then another arrived immediately after. Some women only notice their husbands once another woman does first. Cold moved through me slowly. Not fear this time. Recognition. Lydia wasn't trying to defend herself anymore. She was trying to rot the foundation beneath us completely. And the worst part? Some of what she said was cruel precisely because fragments of it were true. Claire looked up at me immediately. What is it? I showed her the messages without speaking. She read them slowly, then handed the phone back with trembling fingers. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw something inside my wife harden permanently. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat downstairs in the den, with the photograph glowing faintly on my phone, while the house settled around me in slow wooden creaks. The image looked innocent if you knew the truth, damning if you didn't. That's the terrifying thing about implication. It recruits the viewer's imagination to finish the accusation for you. By 3 a.m, I'd received 2 more messages from different unknown numbers. One was just the same photograph, cropped tighter. The second read, "You should think about how embarrassing this could become for Claire." No direct threat, no demand, just emotional leverage. I stared at the screen for a long time before finally understanding something essential about Lydia. This had stopped being about attraction weeks ago. Now it was about humiliation. Rejection had wounded her pride deeply enough that she needed me emotionally repositioned beneath her somehow. Guilty, desperate, ashamed, defensive, manipulative people often cannot tolerate becoming emotionally insignificant to someone they targeted. I took screenshots of everything and emailed them to myself. Then I sat back in the recliner, listening to rain tick softly against the windows. The old leather creaked beneath me exactly the way it always had. Claire bought that chair for my 40th birthday because I used to fall asleep upright after double shifts at the shipping yard. I remember her laughing when delivery men carried it inside. Now you can collapse comfortably. Back then we still laughed easily. It's strange which memories survive. Not major anniversaries, not expensive vacations, tiny moments. A wife stealing fries off your plate. Children asleep in the back seat after fireworks. Your brother teaching your son how to skip stones at a lake. The ordinary pieces hurt most when families break, because they're the parts you never expected to lose. Around 4:30, Claire came downstairs wearing her robe. She stopped when she saw me awake. "You never came to bed." I held up the phone silently. Her expression changed immediately. "What is that?" I handed it to her. She stared at the grocery store photograph for several seconds before looking sick. "Oh my God, there are more." I showed her the messages. Claire sat down slowly across from me. "She took pictures of you. Or had someone take them?" The realization visibly unsettled her. Not just the manipulation anymore. Premeditation. "I don't understand what she wants." I almost answered immediately. Control, narrative dominance, punishment. But another possibility had started forming overnight while I sat alone thinking. "She wants to isolate me," I said quietly. Claire frowned. "Why?" "Because isolated people become easier to define." The room went still. I could see the idea settling into her slowly. Once families begin doubting someone's emotional stability, additional suspicion attaches itself naturally afterward. Every awkward moment becomes confirmation. "He's acting strange lately. He seems withdrawn. He's under stress." The groundwork had already been laid carefully. Claire rubbed her forehead tiredly. "We need to tell Emily and Michael about these messages." "Yes, and Eric." I looked at her. "You still think this can be fixed internally?" "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you think Lydia still cares about the family surviving." Claire opened her mouth, then stopped. Because deep down, she'd started realizing it too. People motivated by shame try to contain damage. People motivated by resentment escalated. Morning arrived gray and heavy. Clouds pressed low against the neighborhood while wind bent tree branches sharply outside the windows. Claire made coffee in a near silence while I printed copies of the messages and photographs from the home office. Paper felt safer than phones suddenly. Physical evidence. Something real. When families fracture emotionally, tangible proof becomes strangely comforting. At 9:30, Eric arrived. He looked worse than before, eyes hollow, same clothes as yesterday. He barely greeted us before sitting heavily at the kitchen table. I didn't sleep. Neither had we. Claire slid the printed messages toward him silently. His face drained of color while reading them. "She sent these? Unknown numbers," I answered. "But yes." Eric stared at the grocery store photograph for a long time. "She followed you, or had help." He closed his eyes briefly. "You need to understand something," he whispered. The exhaustion in his voice made my stomach tighten. "What?" "She's done this before." Claire looked up sharply. Eric rubbed both hands over his face. "In Chicago, there were other situations." "How many?" Claire asked quietly. He laughed bitterly. "I honestly don't know anymore." The kitchen suddenly felt colder. "Why stay?" I asked before I could stop myself. Eric looked at me like I'd asked why drowning people gasp for air. "Because every time things calmed down," he said softly, "she became the person I fell in love with again." There it was. The trap. Not constant cruelty, intermittent tenderness. Just enough warmth between emotional storms to keep hope alive. Manipulative relationships survive through relief as much as pain. Claire sat down beside him slowly. "You should told us." "You think I wasn't ashamed?" he snapped suddenly, then immediately softened. "Sorry, nobody blamed him." That was the tragic part. Because sitting there watching my younger brother unravel in our kitchen, I finally understood he'd been surviving emotional captivity for years, while the rest of us mistook it for marriage. "I kept thinking if I loved her better," he whispered, "she'd stop needing all this attention." Claire started crying quietly. Not dramatic tears, mourning tears for her sister, for Eric, for all the years everyone spent quietly adapting around dysfunction instead of confronting it honestly. I looked toward the window where rain streaked sideways against the glass. "The messages won't stop," I said. Eric nodded slowly. "She won't let herself become the villain." That sentence stayed with me because it explained everything. Lydia genuinely could not tolerate existing inside the family as the person who caused harm. So reality itself had to bend around protecting her self-image. Some people lie strategically, others lie existentially. Without distortion, their identity collapses. Claire suddenly asked the question none of us wanted answered. Do you think she'll send these pictures to Emily? Nobody spoke immediately. Then Eric whispered, "Yes." The room fell silent. I stared down at my coffee, cold already, untouched. And another realization settled into place slowly. This wasn't really about proving innocence anymore. It was about surviving reinterpretation. Even if every accusation collapsed publicly, the emotional atmosphere surrounding me had already changed permanently. People would remember this story in fragments years later. Something happened with Daniel and Lydia. No smoke without fire. They were having problems in their marriage already. That's how reputations die inside families. Not through certainty, through residue. Around noon, Emily called Claire crying. The pictures had already reached her. Of course they had. Claire put the call on speaker after a few minutes because hiding conversations had become impossible now. "Dad," Emily said shakily, "please just tell me the truth." There it was again. Truth reduced into emotional negotiation. I already have. But why would she keep doing this? Because she's angry. At what? I almost said rejection. Instead, at losing control. Emily cried harder. I don't know who to believe anymore. That sentence hurt worse than accusation, because uncertainty from your own child feels like exile. Claire spoke firmly. Your father did nothing wrong, but the photos are cropped deliberately. Emily breathed unevenly through the speaker. I just don't understand how this even started. Neither did I anymore. Not fully. Because somewhere beneath manipulation and loneliness and emotional neglect, there remained a terrifyingly human truth. Families become vulnerable long before they collapse visibly. The visible betrayal is usually just the final symptom. After the call ended, Eric stood slowly. I should go home. You sure? Claire asked. He nodded, then looked at me. If she contacts you again, document everything. I almost smiled at the absurdity. My younger brother speaking to me like a lawyer advising damage control against his own wife. Okay. At the door, he hesitated, then quietly admitted something devastating. I used to think you had the better marriage. The words hollowed the room instantly, because they revealed how effectively families hide suffering from each other. Eric envied the emotional stability Claire and I projected. Meanwhile, Claire and I envied the visible passion he and Lydia still seemed to have despite constant chaos. Both marriages were starving in different ways. After he left, Claire stood silently beside the kitchen counter for a long time. Then softly, "Did we really look that unhappy?" I thought carefully before answering. "No." She looked relieved for half a second. Then I continued. "We looked tired." That was worse somehow, because tired marriages don't attract concern. Society accepts emotional exhaustion between long married couples almost as maturity. People only panic when affection disappears dramatically. Slow emotional erosion gets mistaken for adulthood. Claire walked toward me carefully. I don't want us to become strangers. I looked at her, really looked, at the fine lines near her eyes, the tension she carried constantly in her shoulders, the exhaustion underneath her kindness, and I realized something painful. We already had. Not completely, but enough that another woman noticed the emptiness before either of us admitted it aloud. Claire touched my face gently, a gesture so familiar it nearly hurt. "We can still fix this," she whispered, "maybe." But standing there in the kitchen with storm clouds darkening the windows, and Lydia somewhere outside the house, actively reshaping reality around us, I suddenly understood something fathers learn far too late. Holding a family together for decades means nothing if the people inside it slowly stop seeing each other clearly. That night, after Claire finally fell asleep beside me, for the first time in months, with her hand resting lightly against my chest, I went downstairs alone and sat in the dark living room, listening to the grandfather clock tick through the silence. Around midnight, headlights swept briefly across the front windows. I looked outside, expecting to see Lydia. Instead, it was Eric. He stood in the driveway, motionless beneath the rain for several seconds before walking slowly to the front door, carrying a small cardboard box. Inside were hundreds of printed photographs, old letters, screenshots, receipts, and a journal Lydia had kept for nearly 12 years. Not about me, about everyone. Every manipulation, every lie, every emotional performance she'd staged inside the family. Men she flirted with just to feel powerful. Friends she turned against each other out of boredom. Arguments she deliberately provoked so people would comfort her afterward. And buried near the back of the journal was a sentence written 3 years earlier in her own handwriting. "Daniel is the only man in this family who never needed me, and I think I hate him for it." Eric sat across from me in the dim kitchen until sunrise while the rain hammered softly against the windows, and neither of us spoke much after that. Because sometimes the most devastating thing a family discovers is not that one person lied, but that everyone spent years rearranging themselves around the lie, because the truth would have required changing their entire lives. 3 months later, Lydia disappeared quietly from all our routines. No dramatic farewell, no final confrontation, just empty chairs at holidays, unanswered calls, and a silence that felt strangely heavier than her presence ever did. And one cold evening near winter, Claire found me asleep in the old recliner, with my father's letter still resting open in my lap beneath the ticking clock. She covered me gently with a blanket, stood there for a long time watching me breathe, and finally whispered the one thing no one had ever said to me in all my years of holding everyone together. "You were lonely too."